Hello slimy fertilers, and for you today I have an article which was published by our friends at The Guardian. And I actually love The Guardian because they are so, they have so little self-awareness that they don't realise that the majority of their output on things like this is actually, unintentionally funny. It's like they're trying to copy from things like Private Eye and Spectator and stuff like that, but they don't realise that they're doing it. So let's go on and have a look at this article, which has the title "Toppling Statues. Here's why Nelson's column should be next." Okay, so British journalists are attempting, this British journalist, Afua Hirsch, see a little picture there and a little bio. She's a writer and broadcaster, and her book British is going to be published by Jonathan Cape in September this year. Good luck, and I hope you get a lot of book sales. But yeah, we are basically trying to follow in the footsteps of what's going off currently in the United States, where for some reason people have taken a sudden dislike to statues, not only statues of people who supported slavery, but also statues of people in general. And like them, Afua here seems to have very little grasp of history and the reasons why those statues are actually there, instead deciding just to focus on one thing, or just make something up and focus on that as a justification for what is basically vandalism and historical desecration. As we go along here, I'll have a look through the article. I will fill in the bits of historical information that Afua decides to leave out, because if she left them in, then this article wouldn't make any sense. So, the area I grew up in, leafy Wimbledon in southwest London, which is incidentally inhabited mainly by rich, affluent, middle-class people, but she doesn't want you to know that because then she wouldn't be able to claim oppression, is bordered by memorials on two towering historical figures. One side dedicates its streets and walls to the legacy of the abolitionist William Wilberforce, the remnants of a house where he lounged with his friends, and the mounting block he used to get on his horse to ride to the Houses of Parliament still stand. The other side is devoted to Admiral Horatio Nelson, who, having defeated the French Navy, bought a romantic estate where he stayed with his lover, Emma Hamilton. So many streets, pubs, shops and other businesses recall this history that local estate agents refer to the area as the Battles. These two contemporaneous, although contrasting histories are symbolic of the problems Britain faces in confronting its past. Wilberforce, unquestionably a force for good, helped end, in 1807, Britain's official involvement with the transatlantic slave trade. He was not alone. The enormous contribution of black people in Britain at the time, especially activists and writers who were slaves themselves, no. Slavery was actually formally abolished in 1772 in a case called Somerset's Case. Basically enforced the legal notion that no slaves could be forcibly removed from Britain, and that it was generally illegal for one person to own another. The actual ruling of this law finally decided that the condition of slavery didn't exist in English law at the time, and this resulted in, this is in 1772, the emancipation of all people who were held as slaves in the British Isles. It did not formally abolish slavery elsewhere in the British Empire. That came later, but we'll get onto that when we get there. But needless to say, the statement that people at the time of Nelson and Wilberforce's clashes, which I'll discuss later on in a little bit, there were no slaves. Basically, slavery had been completely abolished within the British Isles in 1772. So this statement is in fact a misleading half-truth at best. One of the obstacles all these abolitionists had to overcome was the influence of Nelson, who was what you would now call, without hesitation, a white supremacist. While many around him were denouncing slavery, Nelson was vigorously defending it. Britain's best-known naval hero, so idolised that after his death in 1805 he was compared to no less than the God who made him, used his seat in the House of Lords and his position of high influence to perpetuate the tyranny, serial rape and exploitation organised by West Indian planters, some of whom he counted among his closest friends. This statement that she just made there is half-truth. You see, at the time, we're talking, Nelson died in 1805 at the Battle of Trafalgar, so we're talking about previous to this. What they were talking about here was the use of slaves on plantations in, the West Indies and stuff like that, basically in the colonies of the British Empire. And William Wilberforce did indeed, William Wilberforce was actually a full-on abolitionist. He believed in the blanket banning of all slavery, which, yeah, fair enough, that's a good thing. But to make the statement here that Horatio Nelson was without hesitation a white supremacist is an extremely erroneous one. You see, Admiral Nelson disagreed with Wilberforce on many things, not just the notion of slavery. And, I've looked and I cannot find anywhere Nelson specifically stating that he was in favour of slavery. If he was a white supremacist, he was a very, very bad one, being as the crews on the ships that he sailed on and ships that were in his naval squadrons included white sailors as well as black and Hispanic and people of all different colours. And at no point did Nelson inflict punishment or slavery or anything on these people. So to call him a white supremacist is a bit stupid, being as that if he was a white supremacist, he either would have refused to have anybody other than white sailors in his fleet, or he would have taken the the non-white sailors and inflicted horrible punishments and indignities upon them. He did none of this. He was actually known to be very, very compassionate towards all the men under his command, because he realised, whereas a lot of the other people who were of the nobility that held positions within the Royal Navy didn't, he realised that you needed to look after your sailors and make sure that they were kept fed and looked after and everything like that, because without sailors a ship doesn't function. And there was no difference in his eyes between black sailors and white. They were sailors, they were all there to do the same job, and he was quite proactive in looking after his men, unlike some other people, like I said, within the Royal Navy. But what he was discussing, what I think the thing that was, the point that's being made here is that Nelson steadfastly refused to abandon the notion of slavery within the empire. Again, like I say, I cannot find any evidence of that. But to say that he had considerable influence in the matter is a little erroneous, being as that, the concept of slavery under British law had already been outlawed in 1772, and the Slavery Abolition Act, or the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which occurred 2 years after his death. He had very little influence over either of those things. The Slave Trade Act 1807 was indeed pushed through by William Wilberforce and his comrades, his abolitionist comrades. That was fine. It went through, and it basically made the Atlantic slave trade involving the British Empire illegal, so much so that the Royal Navy actively blockaded Africa and stopped slave ships, captured them, and released all the slaves that were held on board, and took people who were involved in the slave trade prisoner, and they were treated as criminals. This act was then supplemented by the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which happened a hell of a long time after Nelson's death, which formally outlawed any involvement in slave trading and anything like that within the confines of British influence. This basically meant that British Royal Naval ships actively participated in operations to stop slave trade. They basically stopped the slave trade to America, and using the British naval superiority, and they used these three things: the 1772 case, the Slave Trade Act of 1807, and the Slavery Abolition Act. They used this to pressure other European nations into adopting the same principles, and it worked. Basically, slavery was formally abolished throughout most of Europe by the end of the 1830s. And in a strange way, the British influence also helped to abolish slavery in the United States as well. At the time the U.S. Civil War was happening, both the Confederates and the Unionists appealed or petitioned the European powers for assistance in the war. And one of the things that the European powers told the Confederacy was that they would not assist the Confederacy until it became apparent that the Confederacy was capable of winning the war without assistance, which was basically them saying, we're not going to help you, but not saying it outright. The Unionists were also rebuffed because the subject of slavery came up as well, being as that the European powers also vehemently disagreed with slavery. The notion that the Union would want to win the war and continue with the slave trade was abhorrent to the European powers, which therefore led to the Abraham Lincoln's famous Emancipation Proclamation, which did not free the slaves. It's a common historical misconception. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in areas held by Unionists. So that meant that basically the slave trade was abolished in North America, and there were more slave owners in North America than there were in the Confederate States of America. There were more slave owners and there were more slaves. Slave owners in the Unionist part of North America included quite a lot of black slave owners as well, black slave owners and black slave traders. And until the war was actually won, when the Unionists formally accepted the surrender of the Confederates, at that point then, that's when the slaves were all freed. So the involvement of Horatio Nelson and William Wilberforce in that is not particularly relevant. But that's pretty much what happened, with regards to slavery. It started in, the abolition of slavery. It started in Europe and then eventually worked its way across the Atlantic into the Americas. William Wilberforce, although William Wilberforce was instrumental in getting the Slave Trade Act of 1807 pushed through, he really didn't have that much to do with the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 or any of the other legal precedents in the British Empire that came after that. There were quite a few others. Interesting to note that the Slave Trade Act of 1807 was actually repealed, along with several other laws that were made to abolish slavery. They were repealed in the 1990s because by then more robust laws regarding human rights and stuff like that had already been drafted, so their place on the legal statutes of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, as it became at the time, was no longer relevant. Slaves had been gone for nearly centuries, well over a century, and having several different legal definitions and legal precedents on the books was surplus to requirements when all they needed was just one. The affirmation or the assertion that Admiral Nelson was a white supremacist who hated all black people and wanted to keep slavery is rather an erroneous one. Although he did not own slaves himself, yes, undoubtedly some of his friends within the House of Lords did, but he had very little influence in that particular matter. So to label him as a slave owning white supremacist Nazi bastard is stupid. It's quite frankly, and this is a clear cut case of moral relativism. Times were different back then. It sounds like I'm making it like doing an apologist, but what people that go off on doing articles like this don't seem to understand is that in different times people held different moral standards. So to judge things that happened centuries ago by modern standards is quite frankly ridiculously stupid. There's no, applying stuff like that means a lot of things don't make sense. For example, the actual concept of slavery itself is thousands and thousands of years old, and previous to the notion of slavery is basically anyone who was conquered would be slaughtered. One tribe moves in, attacks another, wins the battle, and then all the remaining people of that tribe would be slaughtered. Slavery was adopted, and it might sound stupid, but it was a more humane option than just slaughtering people wholesale. At least these people got to live and continue living, although yes, their quality of life was very, very low, and they were basically in indentured servitude to the victors, but at least they weren't getting killed. And then over time, the concept of slavery and indentured servitude evolved into the point where slavery and indentured servitude is, formally illegal and abolished in most, in all Western nations. The practice of slavery is still widespread throughout the Middle East and throughout Africa, as is the practice of indentured servitude, because one of the things you have to do is remember that slavery and indentured servitude are two different things. I'm not going into that now. We'll continue reading this article, and let's see what else she's got to say. Okay, so sorry people, I'm not going to continue reading the article. Basically, I didn't realise that the last segment I recorded would go on for so long, and if I continue reading this article and picking it apart, this video will probably end up being about 1 to 2 hours long. Quite frankly, this article doesn't deserve that amount of airtime on my channel or anybody's channel to dissect it, as it just degenerates into white bashing, basically racism against whites, racist things against whites, blaming us now for the events and actions of the past, and slyly demanding, reparations and shit like that for people now that really don't deserve it. I'm sorry, Afua Hirsch here demonstrates that the leftist bias, which is promoted by The Guardian, is just basically, it's completely so unself-aware. They think that they have the right to alter the past, to change the past to reflect what they want in the present, in order to further the narrative that everybody who's white is evil and everybody who's black is good, and no, it's just not happening. So yeah, I will place a link to the full article in the description below. But yeah, that's this video coming to an end now. I just can't be bothered with any more of it. It's just the standard leftist bullshit, trying to justify vandalism and historical revisionism. So yeah, card up on screen, show them social media things. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, subscribe. If you wish to feel generous and donate some money towards me, I could really use it. You can do so through my PayPal. All donations are welcomed and received with thanks. I also now have a channel on VidMe. If you like, then go over and subscribe. I need to push follow. I need to get at least 50 followers before I can unlock the full features of the VidMe platform, which will include the ability to monetize videos, being as I've now demonetized my videos on YouTube. Quite frankly, because I don't want to put money in Google's pockets after the complete bunch of shit bastards that they've shown themselves to be. So thank you for watching, and I will be along again later or sometime with another video of whatever subject happens to I come across that I want to talk about. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.